Palestinian presidency has expressed dismay and concern over the decision of the U.S. Department of State not to grant visas to the Palestinian delegation set to participate in the upcoming United Nations General Assembly meetings in September. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has expressed alarm over the escalating violence in Sudan's North Darfur, condemning relentless attacks by the Rapid Support paramilitary forces on El Fasher. Hello and welcome on Radio Algeria International. I'm Mariam Bershi. Algeria has urged Russia and Ukraine to exercise control and respect for international humanitarian law, stressing the urgency of protecting civilians and prioritizing diplomatic channels to achieve a just and lasting solution to the conflict. Algeria's representative to the UN stressed the importance of favoring dialogue and diplomacy to the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
تشيد الجزائر بالجهود الدبلوماسية الحثيثة.
First, Algeria reiterates its call for the Russian and Ukrainian sides to show restraint and avoid escalating violence in order to avoid the loss of more civilians, ensuring their safety and respecting international law, including humanitarian law, which requires the protection of isolated civilians and civil institutions, including diplomatic institutions. Second, Algeria once again stresses the need to engage in dialogue and negotiation instead of the logic of escalation and confrontation, with diplomatic efforts focused on supporting common understanding and cooperation, which in turn contributes to achieving a fair, comprehensive and lasting solution to war.
She then expressed hope that the upcoming meeting between Russia and Ukraine under the aegis of the US will pave the way for an end to the current escalation.
تجدد الجزائر دعوتها للطرفين.
Algeria hails the deep diplomatic efforts that have recently led to high-level meetings and look forward to the meeting that is expected to bring together the leaders of the two countries under the auspices of US President Donald Trump. We hope that this will boost direct negotiations between the two sides. Third, Algeria encourages the international community to work together to pave the way for constructive dialogue and to maintain the continuity of the path of negotiations in order to find common foundations between the two sides away from polarization and geopolitical calculations. Finally, Algeria reiterates its firm commitment to support any international effort to find a peaceful, fair, and permanent political solution based on the principles and objectives of the United Nations and meets the legitimate security concerns of the two sides.
Let's note that the proposed bilateral meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is scheduled to take place next week. The Algerian ambassador and permanent representative to the African Union, Mr. Mohamed Khalid, has chaired a meeting to examine ways to strengthen coordination, cooperation and consultation between the AU Peace and Security Council and the African Group at the UN Security Council A3+. Asabikar has the details.
This meeting provided a major platform for both parties aimed at revitalizing joint action and coordination and enhancing effectiveness in strengthening efforts to reinforce the African bloc within the UN bodies and defend the continent's interests at the Security Council in line with the recommendations of the high-level seminar on peace and security in Africa known as the Oran process. Algeria's exercise of its dual role as a member of the AU Peace and Security Council and being a member of the UN Security Council reflects its firm commitment and constant desire to strengthen joint African action with a view to establishing security and stability in Africa and to making the voice of AU members heard in UN fora, in order to implement the vision and aspirations of the founding fathers to build a united and prosperous Africa. For their part, the members of the Council welcomed the inclusion of this meeting on the AU Peace and Security Council agenda under the chairmanship of Algeria, welcoming the mature debate around this constructive approach, which is likely to consolidate the ranks of African countries and strengthen their position at the international level.
The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has expressed alarm over the escalating violence in Sudan's North Darfur, condemning relentless attacks by the Rapid Support Paramilitary Forces, RSF, on El-Fasher. Jamal Salmani reports.
In a statement read on his behalf by his spokesman Stéphane Dujarric, Guterres said the relentless attacks by the Rapid Support Forces on El-Fasher in Sudan's North Darfur are appalling, voicing concern about grave risks of serious violations of international humanitarian law.
And the Secretary General said he is appalled by the relentless attack by the Rapid Support Forces on El-Fasher in Sudan's North Darfur state. El-Fasher has been under tightening siege for more than 500 days, with hundreds of thousands of civilians trapped in the area. Recent weeks have seen near continuous shelling of the area and repeatedly deadly incursions into the Abu Shuk displacement camp, where famine conditions were identified back in 2024. And as a stark reminder, since 11th August, our agency documented at least 125 civilians having been killed in El-Fasher area, including through summary executions, with the actual death toll most likely much higher. The Secretary General is alarmed at the grave risk of serious violations of international humanitarian law, as well as violations and abuses of international human rights law, including ethnically motivated violations.
The UN chief called for an immediate ceasefire in and around the El-Fasher area, urging for steps to be taken to protect civilians and ensure the safe delivery of aid.
Supplies are pre-positioned nearby, but efforts by the United Nations and our partners to move them into El-Fasher continue to be hampered. There have been repeated attacks on humanitarian personnel and assets in North Darfur in the recent months. The Secretary General calls for an immediate ceasefire in El-Fasher and the areas around El-Fasher. He insists that immediate steps must be taken to protect civilians and enable the safe, unhindered, and sustained delivery of humanitarian assistance into the area, and allow any civilian seeking to leave the area voluntarily to do so safely.
El-Fasher has been under siege since May, with RSF repeatedly shelling civilian areas despite international calls to protect humanitarian corridors.
Now turning into the Palestinian issue, at least 15 Palestinian civilians were killed today and others wounded when the Israeli occupation forces struck tents for displaced people in the Nasser and Zaytun neighborhoods of Gaza City. According to local sources, the Israeli warplanes bombed tents for displaced people near the youth and sports roundabout in the Nasser neighborhood, claiming the lives of 11 people and wounding others. Meanwhile, 4 people were killed and others were injured as Israeli fighter jets struck the Zaytun neighborhood southeast of Gaza City. The Palestinian ambassador to the UN, Riyad Mansour, has called for condemning the Israeli occupying authorities' decision to force a military presence in the Gaza Strip.
Stop the crime related to famine, which was confirmed for the IPC and the UN, and this crime against humanity need to be condemned, to be stopped, and humanitarian assistance to scale without interruption from Israel, without excuses from Israel to deny the Palestinian people having food, water, medicine in all corners of the globe, which are leading to the death by the hundreds of Palestinian children and civilians. And also to condemn and to demand the reversal of the decision of the Israeli government to unleash massive military force against the Gaza Strip, beginning of not allowing a single person to remain in Gaza City, and to destroy of what is left in Gaza, beginning with the north, in which many reports indicate that 80% of the buildings and the dwellings have been destroyed.
That was the Palestinian ambassador to the UN, Riyad Mansour. The head of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, has stressed that every hour counts to try to save vulnerable people suffering from famine and conflict in devastated Gaza. UNRWA Commissioner General Philip Lazzarini pointed out that the agency has not been able to deliver food since the ceasefire broke down in March.
People living in Gaza are now in a state of famine, which has been declared about a week ago. and now we are talking about a major military offensive with a total evacuation of an extremely weakened population. Every hour today counts. The more we wait, the more people will be dying. Either they will die because of the military operation and the bombardment, or they die because they could not be assisted in time and they are silently dying because of hunger, or they are even dying because they try to desperately seek food going to these infamous distribution places of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. UNRWA cannot function for the time being is when it comes to food distribution, to the delivery of life-saving items to the people, because we have been constrained and prevented to bring anything since the ceasefire breakdown in March this year.
That was UNRWA's head, Philip Lazzarini. The Palestinian presidency has expressed dismay and concern over the decision of the U.S. Department of State not to grant visas to the Palestinian delegation set to participate in the upcoming United Nations General Assembly meetings in September. Jamison Mania has more details in this report.
The Palestinian presidency stressed that the decision stands in clear contradiction to international law and the UN headquarters agreement, notably since the State of Palestine is an observer member of the United Nations. It called on the US administration to reconsider and reverse its decision, reaffirming Palestine's full commitment to international law, UN resolutions and obligations toward peace, as convened in Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas's letters to world leaders, including US President Donald Trump. Several countries and organizations condemned the U.S. decision. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation expressed its deep regret over the U.S. decision and called on the U.S. government to reconsider such a discriminatory decision and to fulfill its obligations under this agreement and respect the role of the United Nations as an inclusive platform for all states and their official representatives. The OIC also called on all parties to the international community, particularly the United Nations, to take urgent action with the relevant U.S. authorities to reverse this decision. Belgium condemned the U.S. decision, calling the move as a blow to democracy. The Belgian foreign minister described Washington's decision as deeply regrettable. Meanwhile, the French foreign minister, for his part, strongly denounced the decision ahead of a meeting of the European Union foreign ministers in Copenhagen, stressing that access to the UN headquarters in New York cannot be subject to any restrictions. He said that the United Nations headquarters is a neutral place in the service of peace, and attendance at the UN General Assembly cannot be subject to any restrictions.
Ministers from the EU's 27 member countries are meeting today in Copenhagen, Denmark, to discuss the Israeli occupying forces' war in Gaza. Divided foreign ministers from the European Union are debating over what action to take regarding Israel's genocidal war in Gaza after the bloc's humanitarian aid chief called on them to find a strong voice that reflects their values and principles amid death, destruction and man-made starvation across the besieged enclave. They will also discuss a proposal that suspends EU funding to Israeli startups as initial punitive action. The bloc has so far failed to get the majority needed to take that step, let alone move ahead with more forceful measures against Israeli occupation forces. Despite member states like Spain and Ireland who want to apply heavy pressure on the Israeli occupying government to stop its punishing attacks on Palestinians, its firm allies such as Germany and Hungary want to take little or no action at all. Spain's Foreign Minister José Manuel Albares told the press ahead of the meeting that the EU is doing too little too late and doing nothing, hadn't achieved anything when it came to the situation in Gaza. He added that he wanted to increase pressure on Israel during the meetings in Copenhagen. The foreign ministers of Iceland, Ireland, Luxembourg, Norway, Slovenia and Spain have strongly condemned the latest Israeli occupying forces offensive in the Gaza Strip and the announcement to establish a permanent presence in Gaza City. Jamison Mani reports.
The joint statement reiterated that the intensification of military operations endangers the lives of hostages and will lead to the intolerable killing of innocent Palestinian civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. The ministers denounced the forced displacement of Palestinians, stressing that it is a blatant violation of international law. The statement affirmed that the systematic destruction of essential civilian infrastructure, including sites serving as refuges for highly vulnerable displaced civilians, is unacceptable. It urged the Israeli occupying government to immediately reconsider its decision and cease military operations. The foreign ministers expressed horror at the integrated food security phase classification, confirmation of famine in the Gaza governorate, and its projected spread to surrounding areas in the coming weeks. They called on Israel to uphold its humanitarian obligations as required under international law. They called for UN agencies and NGOs to be allowed full access to operate on the ground to alleviate the humanitarian catastrophe. The ministers expressed serious concern about the expansion of Israeli settlement construction in the West Bank, stressing its violation of international law, and urged Israel to revoke this decision. The statement stressed that ongoing military operations in both Gaza and the West Bank represent a serious obstacle to implement the two-state solution, which remains the only path toward lasting peace. The joint statement emphasized that the international community will not stand by in the face of human rights violations and will persist in its vigorous efforts to achieve peace.
And with that, we conclude today's news bulletin. Stay tuned to Radio Algeria International for more updates.